So last time we looked at those two sort of disturbing stories. The first one with Lot and his daughters, and we talked about the two sons that came out of that, Ammon and Moab. Talked about the history of Moab and Ammon, and we talked in particular about the idolatry of those two people and the particularly heinous type of idolatry involving human sacrifice and child sacrifice on the part of the Ammonites. And then we looked at Abraham and Sarah repeating the lie that they'd told Pharaoh years before to this guy Abimelech, the king of Gerar. And anyway, so now finally we're gonna see the birth of Isaac that was foretold by God or promised by God, many years before. In chapter 21, verse 1, it says, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said." This was, remember, he'd visited the year before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He'd visited Abraham, and he said, "Yeah, this time next year, your wife will bear a child." Anyway, he visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac, which means he laughs. Remember, this is the name that God had told Abraham to call him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. We looked at that circumcision of that covenant of circumcision, and God had commanded that on the 8th day, right, for all of the males that were born. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." She's playing on Isaac's name there. He laughs. And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." So remember from our study of Genesis 12, when God first called Abram, that he called him to leave his father's house in Haran, and he said, "Go to a land that I will show you." And when he got there, he said, he took him outside, and he said, "Look at the stars," right? "And if you can count them, then you'll be able to count the offspring that will come from you," right? And of course, nobody can count the stars. He promised to bring forth a great nation from Abram's offspring. But more importantly, he said that Abram's seed, that's Sarah, in Abram's seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. That's in Genesis 12, and you can find it in verses 1 through 7. God had made that promise to Abram 25 years before the birth of Isaac. And that began the line that God had foreordained even before the beginning of the creation, that the Mashiach, Jesus, would come forth from the line of Isaac. And in that, he fulfilled and is still fulfilling his promise that all the families of the earth would be blessed through Isaac's descendant. And so just as Abraham and Sarah rejoiced at the birth of Isaac, we can rejoice at our new birth that was brought about through the line of Isaac. So that was in Genesis 12, right when, not long after he first got called out of Haran. And then sometime later, we don't really know, he reiterated this promise that the heir would come from Abram's own body. And Abram believed that, and it was credited to him for righteousness. That is in Genesis 15. And then 11 years after he had left Haran, Abram fathered Ishmael with Sarai's Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. And that pretty much the whole of chapter 16 is devoted to that little Abram and Sarai helping God along with his promise, right?
Because, of course, he can't do it by himself.
And of course, it'd be with an Egyptian, and in Egypt, it symbolically represented the world order.
Mm-hmm.
That's about to change with Hagar.
Yeah.
I think that's coming.
I'm sorry?
Well, aren't they? Sarah's going to drive them out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Got there. I think that's what.
That's actually a little bit later here in this chapter. So then when Ishmael was 13, God appeared again to Abram and established this covenant of circumcision. And, of course, Abram was renamed Abraham, and he circumcised, as Randy pointed out, circumcised himself, which has got to be, you got to be devoted to do that. And he circumcised Isaac when he was 13. And then when Abraham asked that Ishmael live before God, right, to be his heir, God said, no, your heir is going to come from your wife Sarah, and you're going to name him Isaac. And he also said that he would establish an everlasting covenant with Isaac and his descendants, and that's the covenant that we partake in, the new covenant in Jesus' blood. You can read about that in Genesis 17. So now, 25 years after Abram was first called, when Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah was 90, and Ishmael was 14, Isaac finally comes on the scene here, the one through whom all the families of the earth will be blessed. So, speaking of the exile of Hagar and Ishmael, in verse 8 it says, and the child, that is Isaac, grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, that's Ishmael, of course, laughing. Now that word laughing is sahak, and we'll look at that in a minute, because it's almost universally translated as laughing or as mocking or what's the other? Scoffing is another word that they use. But there's one translation. We'll get to that in a minute. Let me finish the passage here. So she saw this the son of Hagar laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman and with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the thing was very displeasing to Abram on account of his son Ishmael, right? So this word sahak, there's one version, the Revised Standard Version, that renders it as playing with, right? Not mocking or scoffing. I thought that was interesting. You know, if he was indeed mocking and scoffing, then Sarah might have been justified in her reaction. But if he was just playing with his little brother at a party that was given in his little brother's honor, I don't think that's quite right. But anyway, the thing though is Sarah clearly either didn't know because Abraham hadn't told her, or she wasn't trusting what God had said about those boys back in Genesis 17. In verse 18 it says, "And Abraham said to God, 'Oh, that Ishmael might live before you.' God said, 'No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I will bless him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year.'" So whether or not Sarah was justified in her reaction, once again, she took matters into her own hands, right? Cast this slave woman out, just like she had when she, bullied Abraham into fathering Ishmael in the first place.
Bullied?
Well, yes. Yeah.
She used her womanly wiles.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe she threatened him to not feed him dinner or something. And anyway, it was her idea.
He didn't exactly.
Well, everything was her idea. It was her idea.
Old lady, womanly wiles.
Hagar to begin with.
Yep, well, that's what I mean. That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Her wifely influence.
Yes. Now, if we look at Genesis, 22:11, what does it say? And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham. It's not really clear what was displeasing: Ishmael's laughter or Sarah's reaction.
I think the way she was mistreating his son,
Right.
he was upset about.
Well, yeah, but we can't really, assume that the text
On account of
doesn't
his
spell
son.
it out. Yeah.
It's displeasing to him because on account of his son.
Yep, I think so too. But the text doesn't, really make it that clear.
In other words, whether he was displeased with Isaac or
Whether he was-
Ishmael or whether he was displeased with Sarah.
Sarah, exactly. But the thing about it is, both of them were acting in accordance with God's will, unknowingly. Listen to what God says in verse 12. But God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy, because of your slave, and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." There's a lesson here for us that we shouldn't miss. God had determined his plan of salvation to bring forth Jesus through Isaac from before the time Jesus said, "Let there be light." So, we talked about this yesterday. God is sovereign. He knows the details of his plan that we don't. When bad stuff happens, we really have no choice, and we should anyway, trust that he knows what he's doing and his will is always good and perfect. What does Romans 8:28 say? God is working all things together for good for those that love him and are called in accordance with his purpose. So it's hard, when you don't know the whole picture. But really, we couldn't know the whole picture, and God knows that. One of my favorite quotes in the whole Bible is on the night before he was betrayed in the upper room. Jesus said, "I have much more to tell you, but you can't hear it right now." God tells us what we're able to handle, and then equips us to handle it.
But just, we're looking at this and we're trying to understand Abraham and Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have scriptures that we have.
Right.
We've got the history. We've got 2,000 years of history of the Christian church. We've got the scriptures. We've got the rewriting of scriptures when the king rewrote them. We got the fact that the printing press came out then. That's the first time people were able to get their own copy. All these things that we've got in our benefit of our understanding and what we can learn.
Yeah. Hey, I've
We
got
didn't have
one.
Any of that.
I've got one for you.
And we still do the same things.
Yeah, we still do.
Yeah.
It's only been probably about 250 years or so
Yeah.
that the average guy could read,
I know. Yeah.
much less have the
Written
stuff
word,
to
yeah.
read here. So the thing is, when we're in the midst of all these details, when all these things happen, you can see it all around you. This whole political quagmire that we're in. We're in the midst of it. It's hard to see that God still has this plan. He's still sovereign, and the plan is still righteous. Yeah. So just like Abraham and Sarah, we lose sight of the big picture when we're mired up in the details. It's funny, I thought that, ironic that Sarah was the one that was wanting to fulfill God's will, even though she didn't really know what it was. And even though her reasons for doing so might not have been the greatest. So, speaking of Hagar, the slave woman, the Egyptian, it's useful for us to go and look at Galatians, what Paul had to say about this. And remember, Paul wrote Galatians for the purpose of answering the arguments of the Judaizers who said that in order to be saved, you need to believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ and follow the law of Moses. The law which they themselves could not follow, obviously. Anyway, so we need to remember that as we read this. It's in Galatians 4 in verse 21. It says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, that's the law of Moses, bearing children for slavery, that is slavery under the law, right? She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem. And the present Jerusalem that Paul was talking about at the time was largely being run by the Sadducees, right? The Pharisees were a sect within it, the conservative sect within it. But the Sadducees really had a lot of power, and they really wanted worldly wealth and worldly things, and they were Greeks basically. So that's the present Jerusalem that he's talking about, this worldly Jerusalem. Let's see. Hagar corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children, right? Slavery to the things of this world.
And to Rome.
And to Rome, of course. But the thing about it is the Romans kind of left the Jews to their own devices for their own internal affairs. As long as they kept paying the taxes and didn't start any insurrections, Rome was fine with whatever they did among themselves. That's why they stood by while Jesus was brought to them. Allowed them to have their festivals and everything, as long as they kept it, once the festival was over, they went on home and started paying their taxes again. Anyway, it says, let's see, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, and this is from Isaiah 54, "Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the one who has a husband." And then in verse 28 it says, "Now you," and that word can be translated as we, brothers, "like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman."
Well, this is an indication of the proper translation back in Genesis of whether it was mocked or scorned or played with. Mm-hmm. He obviously...
Clearly, Paul thought that it was mocking.
Yeah. And he's closer to it than we are.
Yes, and, just if you go by the... It's funny... Well, I won't go off on that. But there was... Well, all right, I will go off on that. In the radar world, they have something called IFF, Identification Friend or Foe. And basically, the radar sends out a pulse, an interrogation pulse, and the airplane sends back a response. Well, only people that have the current code for the day, only their airplane will send out the proper response, right? It's called IFF or SIF, so Selective Identification Feature. Anyway, we had a radar that had that, and they read the codes in ones and zeros. It was painted as a series of bars on the radar scope, right? Well, there was a lot of noise. Sometimes it didn't come back. Sometimes you drop a bit, sometimes you pick up a bit, and it looked fuzzy a lot of the time. So they came out with this SIF enhancer, the IFF enhancer. Well, all the IFF enhancer did was it took the first response, right, put it in a buffer, and barfed it back out instead of the other responses that were coming back from the airplane, right? So if that first response was the correct response, all well and good. If it was wrong, you got just a bunch of wrong ones, right? So that's what this reminded me of, with all of these translations, right? Almost all the translations translate it one way, but they could be wrong, right? As in the experiencing God, so the majority isn't necessarily right?
Yeah, but he didn't have all of those translations.
I know. So if we could go by that, though. If most people agree, then it's probably right. But not necessarily.
Correct.
So in verse 14, it says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and said, 'Have a nice life.' And sent her away." Mm-hmm.
That child was what, about 14?
Yeah, we'll get to that. "And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba." I should say that right. Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes, and she went and sat down opposite, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Now, if we look at this map here, this is the southern desert of Israel. The part that we've been looking at here around the Dead Sea is over here, and then this is the southern part of Israel, and then you can see where when they conquered Canaan, this line right here, this blue and white dotted line, was the one that was the border of Israel. Well, down below here is the northern Sinai, right? And we can see, some important things from today. Gaza is up here. And then southeast of Gaza is Gerar, where this guy Abimelech was king, remember? Well, it says that Abraham moved his tent from the Oaks of Mamre up here in the north by Hebron and moved down to Kadesh. Kadesh is in extreme southern Israel in the northern Sinai. So when he cast out Hagar and Ishmael, her journey would have been toward the north. The Beersheba is up here. And we'll talk about this. Beersheba wasn't called that at the time. Not yet. We'll talk about that a little bit later, how it got its name. So, anyway, see here. And by the way, the locations of Kadesh and of Beersheba are known. They still exist today. So, as Randy was saying, most of the Renaissance paintings that you'll look at of this event have a little baby there, an infant, right? Ishmael. Well, Ishmael was 15 by this time, right? Pretty close to, anyway.
Culturally, he was a adult.
Yeah, because we don't really know how long it took Sarah to wean Isaac, right? But it was probably right around a year, give or take a couple, 3 months. And remember, Isaac was born when Ishmael was 14, so he would have been pushing 15, if not quite 15 by this time. His body would have probably been better able to stand up to the desert than his 30 or 40-something mother, right? But all that's neither here nor there. The other thing about the Renaissance paintings is they have a strange idea of what a bow shot is, right? Because they always show Hagar and Ishmael, a few feet away from each other. Well, must be a very poor archer. But anyway, that's neither here nor there either. So in verse 17 it says, "And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What troubles you, Hagar?'" Like like I don't know, like you needed to know. Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave it to the boy to drink, and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now, the wilderness of Paran is down here south. Well, let me don't do that. Let me do this. South of Kadesh. Kadesh is right here, extreme southern Israel, and the wilderness of Paran is just south of Kadesh. So there's also when you go look at Numbers, it'll talk about the wilderness of Zin. That's up here between Kadesh and the rest of Israel. By the way, Be'er Lahai Roy, what was that famous for? Last time Abraham cast out Hagar, right?
Yep.
And God came to her and said, "Go back." No, actually, Hagar left because Sarah was being mean to her. Sarai was being mean to her. She left, so God came to her and said, "No, go back and submit to your mistress." Anyway, that was the well. There was Be'er Lahai Roy, the well of the living one who sees me, is what that means.
It's interesting that when she left Abraham, she went north, and then they ended up south of where Abraham was.
And she still went north. Well, no, she went south from Mamre the first time.
No, the first time. I'm saying this
Right.
time.
This time she went north back to
She
the
went
same
north
place.
and then ended up going back south with the boy.
Yep.
I guess she was headed toward Egypt again.
Well, as it
Doesn't
says
say
here.
She does. It says that he is.
Well,
took a
he
wife.
grew up and
Yeah.
he lived in
Yeah.
the wilderness,
Mhm.
and then it says he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and then his mother
Took a
was
wife
still-
for him from
So
Egypt.
she tagged along with him as he went on his way. Maybe.
They almost certainly did. I mean, families didn't split up like they do today.
But, they went north and then they ended up
Right.
south.
Yep.
Well, it's interesting because now Ishmael's children are three quarters Egyptian.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Too true. And it shows. We'll get to that in Genesis 25 when we talk about the princes. But there's another map, and basically their land was Sinai and the Arabian Peninsula. The sons of Ishmael, or the descendants of Ishmael, like most of the people in the area, were nomadic herdsmen. There's very little arable land there that they could farm in. Pretty much just the Nile Valley, which of course belonged to pharaohs. Another thing is, these guys were traders, traders, although some of them down south right now are traders as well. The Yemenis, they got a civil war going on down there, right? The Houthi rebels down there.
Yep.
Anyway, centuries after this, God rescued, after this rescue, Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, was sold into slavery by his brothers to Ishmaelite traders who happened to be going by, and they were going to kill him. We'll get to this, but they were going to kill him, but then who was it? Reuben, I think it was, said, no, let's not kill him. Let's make some money off of him. And he had intended to go and release him, but by the time he got back there, he'd already been taken by these Ishmaelite traders and sold into slavery down in Egypt. And we'll start looking at Joseph in Genesis 37. And we'll look in Genesis 25 at the region that Ishmael's descendants settled. Somebody just said it, I think it was Russ, it stands to reason that, Hagar would have got an Egyptian wife since she was an Egyptian herself. But remember, Ishmael was a circumcised Hebrew, right? So that sort of begged the question in my mind, did Ishmael follow the one true and living God? At what point did they fall into the idolatry of the Egyptians? Because almost all of Ishmael's descendants today follow Islam. They don't follow.
Which is not idolatry per se.
Well, it is a monotheistic religion for sure. Anyway, at what
But
point
if
did
Solomon could fall into idolatry, pretty much anybody could.
Yep. Yeah, the wisest guy on the face of the earth, right?
Who directly had revelations from God.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. You know, when did these guys, fall away? Because Ishmael was for sure, son of his father. There's if you go to Dan today, northern Israel, there's a ruin there. It's the world's oldest stone arch gate, 3,000 some odd years old, and tradition holds that it was built by Abraham and Ishmael. So, moving on here in verse 22, at that time Abimelech and Phicol, or however you pronounce that, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me, and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. Now, remember from our study in 19 and 20, the previous study, Abraham had moved down from Mamre, and he lived in Kadesh, but he had to sojourn in Gerar, right? That's up here, all right, if I can find it. Gerar is somewhere around here, right? So he was living down here in Kadesh, but he was, sojourning up there in Gerar. And you remember from the previous study, that was where he lied to Abimelech about Sarah being his sister. Now, I believe that this whole episode that we just looked at from verse... One more. Starting in verse 8, I believe that whole episode down to verse... when we just looked at verse 21, I believe that was interposed here. Just me talking. But I believe the rest of this chapter belongs with the first part of the chapter. Is this making sense? And the reason I say that is because here in verse 22 it says, at that time. Well, what time? Not the time that God rescued Hagar. The time that he and Abraham had that little parlay about Sarah. Remember, God had appeared to Abimelech in a dream and said, if you don't give this guy's wife back, you're going to die. And I believe that dream was fresh on Abimelech's mind when he came to him and said, hey, I've dealt kindly with you, now you deal kindly with me.
Well, I think it makes some sense that isn't in. What's happened is basically he's putting they put into the narrative the explanation of why it has the name Beersheba.
Yes, but I don't believe it's the same well. It's, if you look carefully at the story with Hagar, it says that she went toward Beersheba. And it says that God told her, look, there's this well here. Well, clearly this next passage says that Abraham dug the well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's the same well, but I could be wrong.
No, well, but the area is still...
It's still in the same area, yeah. Anyway, let's look at it.
Well, the names are... Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That could be, and that's common in literature of the time. We think linear, and they think circular. I mean, they go through and then they come back
There,
and
watch out, your hand's liable to get
in the middle of it and explain some things and then go back to the narrative.
Yep. I'm reading a book that's like that now. It jumps back and forth. There's a great book called Sometimes a Great Notion by Ken Kesey where he does that every paragraph or every sentence. And he does it with different punctuation. Like one paragraph will be in parentheses, another one will be in italics, another one will be in blank, and you don't know it until you're like 100 pages into the book that you're actually jumping back and forth into different stories, and the stories don't all come together till the very end. It's really a challenging read. Anyway, so Abimelech came to him and said, "Hey, let's be nice to me because I've been nice to you." And then in verse 25 it says, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, "I do not know who's done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today." And that's why I thought these things all go together, right?
Yeah.
So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you've set apart?" He said, "These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well." Therefore that place was called Beersheba, the well of the 7-fold oath. And that's how it got its name. That's why I said it wasn't, it may have been named that. It all depends on how the order of these things really was, whether it was the same order we're reading them in or whether it was in a different order. But if they're in chronological order, then the well hadn't been named that until this oath was made. So,
Well, it doesn't say she was at the well of Beersheba.
right, it just says she was in the area. And of course, it's being written much later. Yes,
So
ma'am.
we're assuming that that's the same well that she was at, or possibly?
I don't, but it's possible. I don't. I think it's different, but
Well, it really wasn't a well that she got water from.
It was a spring.
It was a spring, yeah. And it wasn't named Beersheba. It was
yeah, but
the area was named that after.
But the scribe that wrote it down years and years and years later, hundreds of years later, called it by that name.
By the
And
name
this,
that people would understand.
right. This isn't the first time this has happened.
Oh, yeah.
The other example that we've looked at, anybody remember? Bethel
Yeah.
was called Luz at the time. Bethel wasn't named Bethel. It was named Bethel by Abraham's grandson, Jacob. So anyway, I said here it's unlikely, it's possible, but unlikely that this was the same well. But that's just my opinion, like I said.
Well,
If it is
It
the same
could have
well,
been.
then it would...
I don't think it could have been because the other wasn't a well.
well, yeah. Yeah. And the answer doesn't really matter. What we know for sure is that Abraham says point blank, he dug that well, right? And by the way, the location of that city, Beersheba, it still exists today. That's the area just west of there is where Israel keeps taking these rockets from Gaza, and that's where the attack on October 7th was launched toward Beersheba and all the settlements that are just east of Gaza there, southeast of Gaza. But the location of this particular well isn't known. So in verse 32, so they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. That word there is Philisti, and it means immigrants. We'll look at that in a minute. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called thereupon on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Now, this is the first time we've seen this name of God. It's Jehovah El Olam. Jehovah, the God everlasting, is what that means. in the order of the words. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. Now, these are seemingly innocuous verses, but they're kind of intriguing, because if the writer of Genesis was Moses, as is traditionally held, there was a passing remark made in Genesis 10, verse 14, that the Philistines were descended from the Casluhim, who were in turn descended from Misraim, also known as Egypt. And Misraim, or Egypt, depending on the translation you look at, was one of the sons of Ham, so Noah's grandson. But apart from that brief mention of the Philistines, this mention here in 21:32 is the first mention of the Philistines and their land. Now, assuming that Moses was the writer of Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch, which is traditional that he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, presumably, by the way, with some assistance from whoever wrote the story about his own death, right? Since Deuteronomy talks about him dying and being buried in the valley of the valley of Moab. Then Genesis must have been written prior to the conquest of Canaan, right? Because Moses died before the conquest of Canaan began. Well, that conquest happened right around 1250 BC, or started right about then, and then it lasted for 8 or 9 years, something like that. But since Moses had already died, the book of Genesis must have been written before that, right? Now,
Interesting note on the tamarisk tree. Takes slow growing, takes 400 years to reach its full height, grows about an inch a year,
wow.
can survive in the desert, and it symbolizes hope, life, and new beginnings. And it's only Christianity that recognizes that. The other Hinduism, Islam, they don't.
What is that?
That
The tamarisk
tree-
Oh, the
tree.
tamarisk. Okay.
Tamarisk.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, this name Misraim is a plural name because of the I am at the end, right? We know that much Hebrew, right? Like Elohim is the plural, the true plural, right? The two or more. The more than two.
And which word are you talking about?
Misraim, which is, if you read different translations, in Genesis 10 it talks about the descendants of Ham, and some of them say Egypt was one of his sons, and some of them say Misraim was one of his sons, but that's a plural noun. So it may be a people that was descended from Ham, not a specific son. The word Egypt, or the name Egypt, is used, pretty much throughout the world, to refer to the people that live around the Nile Valley, right? Live next to the Nile. And also, as we've seen in the Bible, Egypt is also symbolic of the world and of worldliness and of human will. Now, with regard to these Philistines, archaeological evidence in Gaza and up and down the Mediterranean coast of Israel suggested that the Philistines originated around the area of Crete, and they arrived on the shores of Gaza in the eastern Mediterranean right around 1200 BC. So right about the same time that the Israelites arrived back from 400 years in Egypt.
So
Right.
1200 BC, could that possibly have been when the Minoan civilization came to an end?
I don't know.
I'll look that up real quick.
Well, the possibility
They-
too is that it's two different sets of people referred to by the same
name. Well, and the name means immigrants, right?
Yeah.
Or the word means immigrants. So it could have been any immigrants.
1100 BC.
I
Yeah,
always had
so-
an interest in Crete.
They left, or they arrived in Palestine before their civilization died, I guess. if in fact these Philistines were Cretans. So if these are the same guys, then either Moses wrote Genesis very late in his life and maybe had some additional things filled in by somebody else, maybe Joshua. Or, these are different Philistines, or the timing just isn't, the archaeological, we haven't discovered these particular people that it's talking about here at the end of this chapter. But take careful note of that last passage. It says that then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. It doesn't say that they were Philistines, right? It says that they returned to the land of the Philistines, which would have been known by the time Genesis was written. So whether or not they were of the same people, who knows? But if the archaeological evidence is correct, the Philistines didn't show up, until Abraham had been dead for 400 plus years, probably closer to 500 years, because you had to have Isaac and Jacob, right, before the Egyptian captivity. So anyway, that was all I had. I wanted to devote an entire session to this sacrifice of Isaac, because there's so much written about it. Lots of people know about it. I mean, practically everybody knows about the sacrifice of Isaac, or the called for sacrifice of Isaac that didn't take place. Even, unbelievers. Richard Dawkins uses the sacrifice of Isaac to make his point that God is the ultimate child abuser. Right? Because, of course, he sacrificed his own son, right? Which sort of begs the question, if God doesn't exist, does this even matter? It's funny how guys like Dawkins make their arguments like that in terms as if God existed when they claim that he doesn't.
Understand and comment about him, though. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What I thought about is interesting. You're talking about the cultures there and the type of idolatry that included child abuse, and it's just of child sacrifice, and it's like Satan is always doing counterfeits of what God does, and it's interesting that in these idolatrous cultures, the death of a child was in some sense, a salvation thing, which is just the corruption of Satan of God's eternal plan.
This is going to go on the recording,
Yeah.
so if I'm not alive next week, you'll know why. Islam is a satanic counterfeit of Christianity, brought into being by a demon-possessed child molester.
Yeah.
His wife was 6 when he married her, Muhammad. May police be upon him.